So would you now take your Bibles and open them to Matthew chapter 14, the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. I'm resuming my study in this textual study in the Gospel of Matthew. The last thing we looked at was Jesus just told some parables, a series of parables, and then he went to his hometown, the town of Nazareth, where he was pretty much run out of town, was rejected by his own home people. They did not accept him because they looked at him as being young Jesus who grew up in the carpenter's shop with his earthly father Joseph, and they're thinking to themselves that he cannot be someone great and cannot certainly be, as some people claim, as the Messiah, the Christ. And so he's pretty much rejected by his own hometown. And Jesus would not dwell and stay around in places where he was not welcome. And so he moved on and was always moving on, going to different places and proclaiming the gospel and healing the sick and ministering to the hurting and so forth. And we find, by the way, the title of my messages you'll see on the screen tonight is The Death of John the Baptist. And we looked at him in Matthew chapter 3 as he was the one called by God to be the forerunner of the Messiah. He was the cousin of Jesus, being that his mother Elizabeth was a cousin to Mary, the virgin girl, who was the mother of Jesus. And so Jesus and John the Baptist were cousins, and he was the forerunner. He's the one who baptized Jesus. And Jesus had said of him that of all the men and all the people that have lived in this earth, there's none greater than John the Baptist. And yet John the Baptist said of Jesus that he is one of whose shoes I am not worthy to even unloose. And he goes before me, said John the Baptist. And John the Baptist had looked up to Jesus when he was baptizing, before he had baptized Jesus, and said, "Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sins of the world." And so John the Baptist thought very highly of Jesus. And we see here tonight, we're going to look at the death of John the Baptist and what led to the death of John the Baptist, the circumstances around it. It says, at that time, in chapter 14, verse 1, at that time. At what time? Again, right after Jesus was rejected in his hometown of Nazareth. Herod. You've heard of Herod. You know who that is, right? I mean, Herod was the one who killed all the babies when Jesus was born, right? Well, partially right. Herod's father was the Herod at that time, Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the Herod who was the ruler among the Jews when Jesus was born, and when word got out to him that Jesus, the king of the people of Israel, was being born, Herod was jealous, Herod was infuriated, and Herod had no desire to do anything but to eliminate this baby Jesus when he would be born. And so he decreed that all babies be thrown into the lake. All babies be thrown into the water, that they would perish, that they would die. So that's what Herod the Great did. Herod the Great was not a very good man. He was a very evil person. Herod the Great had as many as, no one really knows how many. It is believed that he had perhaps as many as 5 to 10 wives. And he had multiple children by these different wives. One of the children that he had was a son by the name of Herod Antipas. He also had a son whose name was Archelaus, another one whose name was Philip, and he had a son whose name was Aristobulus. Now, if you will notice, it says in chapter 14, verse 1, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch. What does the word tetrarch mean? Tetrarch is a word which means 1/4 ruler of a kingdom. So the Romans allowed, when Herod the Great died, the Roman Empire allowed the Herods to continue in their rule, although they pretty much were puppets to the Roman Empire. It was more just a thing of noticing this royalty among the Herod family, and they really had no power because the Romans were in power, but they allowed the Herods to continue, and but they could not have one ruler like Herod the Great was. When Herod the Great died, the Romans split Herod the Great's kingdom 4 different ways. Now, 3 of those sons, which were Herod Antipas, Herod Archelaus, and Herod Philip, were allowed to each have 1/4 of the kingdom. Who did the final 1/4 of the kingdom go to? Went to Herod the Great's sister, Salome the First. So that's how it was split, the kingdom, 4 different ways. And that's why Herod is called here in chapter 14, verse 1, a tetrarch, although Herod Antipas, this is Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, keep that in mind, Herod Antipas is his name. He is the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. That was his territory. And Herod Antipas wanted to be called king, but the Romans would not allow him to be called king. However, that being said, Mark, in his version of Mark chapter 6, referred to Herod Antipas as being a king. But he was nothing more than a tetrarch, only in charge of 1/4 of the kingdom that his father was in charge of. Now, it says here in verse 1, Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus. Now, the word fame here is a word which means public or favorable report. And so, in other words, Jesus had a very favorable and public report around that area of where people were living at that time in the known world, because he had made the blind see. He made the deaf hear, the mute talk, the lame walk. Jesus cast out the demons from the demon-possessed. Jesus had done many incredible, indescribable, and unbelievable things. So his fame had begun to spread among everyone. And that's what it means here when it says Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus. And he said, when he heard what Jesus was doing, and do understand that back in those days they did not have computers, the internet, they did not have cell phones where we can go on those little electronic or mini computers that they are now as smartphones and find out information and what's going on here and there. They didn't even have newspapers. They didn't even have telephones back then. They didn't have radio. They didn't have television. Things got around by word of mouth. It was a much slower pace back then. And so word got out about Jesus and the great things that he was doing, and how multitudes, great crowds, were coming to hear Jesus and to follow Jesus. And so Herod Antipas hears of the fame, this public and favorable report of Jesus. But now, being that Herod Antipas was not there in the crowds and had not seen Jesus, Herod, his thinking was, in his mind, this must be John the Baptist come back to life. Now, you may be thinking, when did he ever die? We'll see that. He's really basically, when Matthew is writing this, the first 2 verses may seem out of context, in that starting with verse 3, he's going to revert back to something that had happened in the past that led up to the death of John the Baptist. But verses 1 and 2, he's thinking back. And he says, this must be John the Baptist who has come back to life from the dead. And therefore the mighty works do show forth themselves in him. First of all, in my studies of John the Baptist, I do not recall him doing mighty works. He was a fiery preacher, a strong preacher at that. But doing miracles, no. I don't recall hearing that. Do you? And so Herod Antipas is thinking it must be John the Baptist is doing these works. Well, I don't know what led him to think that John the Baptist would do miracles, but I guess because he's just such a dynamic personality, a dynamic preacher. And maybe he's thinking that. But we get to verse 3 now, and you got that little paragraph symbol. That means the story is changing a little as we are going to now look at what happened here in the death of John the Baptist. It's like a soap opera, folks. I mean, this is a mess. What we're going to look at here in a few moments is a family all messed up. A real life soap opera that you would think only someone in Hollywood would write a script like this. Well, let's look at it. It says, Herod laid hold on John. Laid hold on means arrested John the Baptist. That is Herod Antipas. Again, Herod Antipas, he had half-brothers. I don't know if any of them were full brothers because just about every son Herod the Great had, he had by a different wife. And so just about every one of those brothers, they all had the same father, Herod the Great, but a different mother. So you had Herod Antipas, Herod Archelaus, and Herod Philip. 3 brothers right there were chosen to rule as tetrarchs along with their aunt Salome. They also had a brother whose name was Aristobulus. Remember that name. Very important for you to remember that name in just a moment to see how messed up this family was. But it says Herod had arrested or laid hold on John the Baptist, and he bound him and put him in prison for Herodias' sake. Now, who is Herodias? Herodias was a daughter of Aristobulus, who happened to be one of the sons of Herod the Great. All right, that's easy to figure out then. Herodias was a granddaughter of Herod the Great, right? Now, Herodias married Philip, who happened to be also a son of Herod the Great. Therefore, she married her uncle, Philip, Uncle Philip. Now, that's messed up, and it gets even more messed up. Hang with me. Follow as best you can. So she marries Uncle Philip. He marries his niece, that is his brother, his half-brother, Aristobulus' daughter. Now, Herodias marries him, and then all of a sudden Herod Antipas, the other brother, half-brother to Philip and Aristobulus, he takes notice of Herodias one day, and he divorces his own wife and steals Herodias from his half-brother Philip. What a mess. All right. Now, I'm about to get lost myself. I got to really concentrate here. We find then that Herodias married Herod Antipas. I'm getting there. His brother Philip's wife. And John the Baptist was a preacher of righteousness. And John the Baptist said, that is wrong. You might be the Herodian family, and you may think that it's all right for you to do that, but in the eyes of God, it is wrong. It is an absolute sin for an uncle to marry his niece, and it is an absolute sin for your half-brother to divorce his wife just so he can steal your wife away from you. And by the way, when Herod Antipas stole away Herodias from his half-brother Philip, and married Herodias, he also married his niece because she was his niece, the daughter of his half-brother Aristobulus. Now, if you are totally messed up, mixed up, and lost, that's all right. I'm not going to dwell any more on this. I just wanted you to see how messed up this family was. Now, John the Baptist is the preacher who is trying to tell them they're wrong. He is trying to correct them. He is reproving them. He's rebuking them. He's preaching to them and saying that you are sinning against God by your actions and what you're doing. Now, this is why John the Baptist was arrested by Herod. It says here, notice in verse 3, for Herodias' sake. Herodias apparently said to Antipas, her new husband / uncle, she looks at him and says, you go get John the Baptist and have him arrested and thrown in prison right now because I don't like him saying what he's saying about us. I don't like these comments he's making about us. So for my sake, you go and get him and you put him in jail. Now, John the Baptist, what he had said to them in verse 4 is, it is not lawful for thee to have her, Herod. It's not lawful for you to have Herodias. And when Antipas, it says in verse 5, when he, that's Antipas, would have put John, that's him, is John the Baptist, to death, Herod Antipas feared the multitude. Why did he fear the multitude? All right, here's what I want you to do. Hold your place at Matthew 14, and I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 11. We actually looked at this a few weeks ago. Remember when John was in prison? It was believed that he was in there for at least about a year. And he was getting discouraged, and he was beginning to think that I'm here in this prison, and Jesus is out there doing this work, and he's not helping me. He's not helping me. And I'm wondering, now I'm beginning to wonder, says John, if he really is the Messiah. John actually began to wonder that. So Matthew chapter 11, 1 through 6 says, it came to pass when Jesus had made an end of commanding his 12 disciples, he departed thence to teach and to preach in their cities. Now when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples and said unto them, art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? Jesus answered and he said, go and show John again those things which you do hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have the gospel preached unto them, and blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended in me. So Jesus' answer to John the Baptist, wondering if he really is the Messiah, because he's not coming around. Jesus' answer is, you just tell John to notice what great things I'm doing. And don't be offended in me. Now, then we go on here and we see, I want you to notice that we find that Herod Antipas was afraid to kill John the Baptist, preacher. He was afraid to kill him because he was considered to be a prophet, and he was recognized as a prophet among the people. We see that in Matthew chapter 21, 24 through 26. If you want to turn there, you can. Matthew 21, 24 through 26. And there it says this, Matthew 21, 24 through 26. And Jesus answered and he said unto them, I also will ask you one thing, which if you tell me, I and likewise will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, whence was it? From heaven or of men? And the disciples reasoned within themselves, and they said, well, if we say from heaven, he will say unto us, why did you not believe in him? As to the religious leaders, rather. But if we say of men, we fear the people, for they all hold John as a prophet. So, the crowd, the people, recognized John as being a prophet. Now, Herodias was upset at John the Baptist too. She was so upset that she is the one who asked her husband, Antipas, to go and arrest John for preaching this against them and their family. Herodias had a quarrel with John too. And in Mark's version, Mark said this in Mark 6:19, therefore Herodias, she had a quarrel against him, and she would have killed him, but she could not. What prevented her from doing it, I don't know, but she could not kill John the Baptist preacher. Now, so Herodias is all this time to try to think this thing through. How am I going to get John the Baptist dead? She hated him. She hated him, literally hated him, because he preached the truth to her and her family. What is she going to do? Well, it just so happened that Herod Antipas had a birthday coming up, and he was going to plan a banquet. I mean, if you look in the Gospel of Mark, it says he got all the rulers of the known world at that time, anyone who's everyone who's anyone, to come to that banquet for a birthday party. And Herodias thinks, now this would be the great opportunity to work something out to get him dead. So Herod Antipas is going to have the birthday party, and Herodias had a daughter. She was not Antipas's daughter. She was Philip's daughter, who Herodias had been married to before, that being her uncle. But anyway, long story short, Herodias is their offspring, or rather Salome is their offspring to Philip and Herodias. You say, I thought Salome, I heard that name a little bit ago. You did. Herod the Great had a sister named Salome the First, who had 1/4 of the kingdom. She was a tetrarch of the kingdom, along with the other three Herod's sons. And I don't know, but maybe Philip and Herodias named their daughter Salome after his aunt, which would be her great aunt. I don't know, but it's just the thought. But her name was Salome. How old was she? I don't know. Some think she might have been as young as 12 years old. Some think she might have been 16, 18. No one really knows how old this young girl was. But she started to dance in front of Herod Antipas. And those men started drinking. They're drinking and drinking and drinking to Herod. Perhaps is in a drunken stupor now. And this young girl is dancing in front of them. And so Herod is now out of his mind, literally. And Herod, as he sees this young girl, in a way he should not be beholding her as she's dancing for him at the request of her mother. It's all so ungodly. Why would a mother put her daughter in front of a bunch of drunk men in that way? It shows Herodias was not a good person. But anyway, let's look at it. It says in verse 6, when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod, whereupon he promised with an oath. He promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask. Mark gets a little more descriptive here, and Mark says in his version, Mark chapter 6, verse 20, that Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just man and holy. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry. Mark chapter 6, verse 23, actually, is what I want to read to you. We find there that Antipas had sworn to the young girl and said, whatsoever thou shalt ask me, I will give it thee unto the half of my kingdom. The half of his kingdom Good gracious. The man obviously was drunk for him to even suggest that. He didn't know what he's doing. And by the way, getting back to that verse I started to read a moment ago, which is verse 20 of Mark chapter 6, I want you to know that Herod Antipas, as bad of a man as he was, all of them were bad. They all were. They were all an ungodly family. And so Herod Antipas, he liked hearing John the Baptist talk. He actually would go to him at the prison and hear him talk. And it said that he respected him. He feared him. The word fear means respected. Mark 6:20, Herod feared or respected or revered John the Baptist, knowing that he was a just man and a holy man, and observed him. He observed him, listened to him. He listened to John as John would teach or John would talk. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. He did many things, meaning that he would tell other people about this man, John, in the prison. That's only there because for Herodias' sake, she wanted him there. But Herodias not only wanted him there, she wanted him dead. And so now we see what she has done with the daughter. And Herod now is drunk, and he says to the daughter, I'll give you up to half of my kingdom, whatever you want, whatever you ask for. And all of this is rehearsed. It's planned in advance, in that Herodias had discussed with Salome, her daughter. When this happened, she knew it would. You ask for nothing more or nothing less than the head of John the Baptist on a platter. You asked for it. Now that's gruesome. That is so gruesome when we think about it. And that's such a graphic thought. But yet that's the reality of what happened here. And so it says in verse 8, she, being before instructed of her mother, she said to her drunk father, stepfather, whatever you want to call him, she said, give me here John Baptist's head in a charger. The word for charger there is a word which means platter, like a silver platter, big plate, a big plate that would hold a head. So, sure enough, Herod Antipas decrees that it must be done. And it was carried through. And verse 11 says, his head was brought in a charger, on a platter, given to the damsel. She brought to her mother. I don't know how young this girl was, but can you imagine how it must have felt for her, for these men, soldiers, whoever, to bring a plate with a man's head that had just been beheaded and cut off, blood all over the plate, dripping to the floor, and hand it to her. If she's like any normal young teenage girl, she's probably going to scream as she would see the sight of this gruesome thing. And if she didn't, then that shows she's as cold-hearted as any of the rest of that family. But anyway, they brought the head out to her. And the disciples of John the Baptist, and he had disciples. They were followers of John the Baptist. And when they heard what had happened, they came and requested the body. They took it and buried it. And then they gave him a proper burial. Whether they got the head to bury with the body, I don't know. But they at least had the body. Perhaps they allowed them to take the head too. And they buried John the Baptist and gave him a proper burial. This great man of God had to lose his life and end his life in this way. All for preaching the gospel. And then the last part of this verse, I want you to see verse 12. They went and told Jesus. You know, that's the thing all of us should do. When we're troubled by something, if we are sick, if we lose something in our life, if we lose a loved one or something like that happens, something bad in our life happens, go tell it to Jesus. Talk it over with him. He wants to hear us. He wants to hear from us. And so that's what these men did. They buried John, and then they did the most important thing they could do at that point, is go to Jesus. When something tumultuous, something frightening, something bad happens in our lives, go to Jesus. Take it to him in prayer. He wants to hear from us, and he will be the one that will give us comfort. So it's a sad thing, the death of John the Baptist. But just like in anyone's case, if they are followers of the Lord, to die as a follower of Jesus or as a Christian, that's that person's gain when they leave this life. So I am standing here to say now that I admire John the Baptist and what he did. But even more so, I admire and praise my Lord Jesus, of whom John preached about. It's all about him. If John the Baptist could walk into this room right now and stand before us, he'd tell us that. He'd say, don't let the praise be on me. Let it be on Jesus. He must increase, and I must decrease. Let us pray.